universal, their term, rights and norms. So, moving then toward the question of equitable web archiving. We have as a principle of the World Summit on the Information Society, environments of equitable ICT use and appropriation. And so we took that phrase and said, well, what would it mean to see a situation in which web archiving was happening in an equitable manner? We think that involves both the collection materials and the access to materials. And we think that it matters, that what we do in collaborations matters as far as being able to end up with an equitable environment. For archiving itself, we would like to push the envelope as individual scholars, encouraging each of you as individual scholars, as well as those of you who are from libraries or other kinds of institutions that could be engaged in this, to explore broad collection policies, to really think through very consciously what the collection policy is of the archiving activity in which you're engaged, to have every view toward representing the diversity of cultures that are producing materials around the topic or theme or issue that you're collecting. So if we could speak to the national libraries, if there are any here to say, think about things of national significance as having transnational dimensions to them and include that in your collection policy. We would love to see archiving activity funded in transnational ways. I know it's very difficult to receive funding based in a northern country to collect internationally. And again, copyright concerns are at the core of that, but I think Laura and Brits have done us a great favor in their Journal of Information Science article about the moral framework that could be used to justify and actually promote transnational archiving. And so we'd like to see more funding for this, and we would like to see a team of activists that push for this. We would also like to see greater awareness and sensitivity across national borders to preservation of web materials in a global context. Again, if the rates of increase in web production, so rates of web production continue to increase in the global south, the value of those materials will only grow over time, but can only be preserved in the immediate sense, because most site producers overwrite their files as soon as they update their site. And when it's gone, it's gone. So we'd love to see greater awareness in regards to the site producers themselves, but also to preservation internationally. Finally, then, we would like to make the argument that web archiving is a way of preserving open access to these culturally significant materials, but only if we have open access to the web archives. So we're doing a bit of a trick here, using open access both ways, and saying that it really should be a matter of great import and an ethical reflection that the ethics of web archiving concern not only the rights of the site producers, but also concern the global community in terms of being able to have access to a history that is effectual and influential as it happens, but very easy to expunge or revise from a backwards perspective. So we would love to see a mandate that libraries and archives find ways to ensure that web archives are web accessible as the first step toward making them open access. And we would like to see institutions and consortiums like the Consortium of Research Libraries in the US open their collections to scholars globally and move beyond seeing access as membership access or geographic access. We also think that critical to open access to web archives is indexing quickly. Another of the travesties that is happening in the US is that the Library of Congress is collecting at a rate far greater than it has devoted resources to indexing, which means it's collecting terabytes of data and putting it in the equivalent of a shoebox with a label on the cover saying these materials all pertain to X, and not devoting the resources necessary to index or catalog in a way that would actually make it usable, even if one could get to Washington, D.C. to access it. So beyond web access, we've got to have a commitment to indexing so that these materials are actually sortable and usable. We'll close with this notion of collaboration and a proposition that we rethink collaboration as scholars to include not just archives and libraries, as Steve suggested, but to think about it in north-south terms as well, and to be thinking creatively here together about how we can encourage collaborations between archivists and researchers in the north and the south in various permutations. So the arrows you see in the multiple directions here are suggesting that it might be very fruitful for researchers in the north to find institutes in the south that could do some kinds of collection identification and long-term preservation and storage. And it could also be useful for researchers from the south to have ways to network with institutes, libraries from the north. We would love to talk with anyone who's got interest in this area and see what other kinds of radical schemes we can cook up. Thank you.
Short time for questions, if there is. Yes?
Archiving is, as you describe it, sounds like mostly about static pages, things that are up there rather than something that is JavaScripty, server devised. How do you deal with things that depend on particular technologies that are developed within a site, that are unique to that site, that are not active server? Well, how do you deal with active server pages? How do you archive the things that are not static?
Say, let's have lunch. And one nutshell is there are some applications for which there have not been good archiving technologies developed yet.
Right.
It's a matter of great significance for us as we design research to think very carefully about the periodicity with which we're capturing something. And so we do attempt, to the extent that it's important for our research, and sometimes that's a matter of every hour or every 30 minutes we're grabbing a particular set of pages that are changing fast. Say on the evening of an election where you're getting returns posted like this. So, but it's still, it's freeze frame. It's a matter of sequencing a bunch of stills and making something that is essentially dynamic, static in a time sequence in order to catch momentum.
There's another element as well that's even at a simpler level. Whenever you visit a website, you're coming from a particular browser on a particular machine, and you're using an external archivist, you're coming from another browser and another machine, and so just keeping that straight before you even get to the ActiveX issues. The answer is, yeah, do the best you can.
That's right. Okay.
Yes?
Yeah, I commend the work you're trying to do, especially in terms of trying to promote the open access to the archive. So that suggests that your work has to model that open access, and you suggested that it did. But presumably there are lots of questions of copyright, et cetera. So what are you doing, a kind of Creative Commons access? Talk a little bit about the way you framed it in IP terms.
We've done, at this point, personally, 5 different studies, 5 different archival collections, 2 of which we've done in partnership with the Library of Congress and the Internet Archive in order to ensure public access. One of which is, I think, a very interesting case study in that we took the initiative in 2002 to get a very large grant from a foundation that we knew would insist on public access to the collection. We took that to the Library of Congress and said, we would like to give you this in exchange for matching funds and a contractual assurance that you will host this publicly for 4 years. They agreed to it in the 2002 election. And in 2004, when we did not take that initiative, they collected with no plan for display or access. So it showed the kind of influence that we as individual scholars could have on a national library institution by putting that kind of teeth into a matching grant that we took initiative to get. So that's, I'm just saying, there's a number of different scenarios. That's one that we use to try to push it.
But if you're taking a picture of somebody else's, which might be real simpler, somebody else's web, which they presumably have a certain amount of intellectual property rights in, but you're giving access to that, it looks like there's an IP issue. So how do you handle that?
Well, that's it. On those occasions and for the collections for which we think that long-term public access would be a public good, we've worked with the Library of Congress because they hold the office, they are the Office of Copyright for the United States. We've done other collections that are scholarly collections that we use under fair use, where we display particular elements of a collection for the purpose of critique and reflection. And that's covered in the US under fair use. But we do not make, so we have some collections which we have not made entirely web accessible because we're still arguing through this with our institutions and with copyright holders. So there's different protocols that have been used for each of the studies we've done.
Yeah, and the issue of copyright and fair use, it depends on who is displaying and in fact owns the collection. And so at a university level, if it's our university that owns it, they have their lawyer in fact has to agree that they can display it. It's as individual scholars, if we put it up on our own site, it's still under a university rubric. And so there's a different set of layers of control.
Make friends with your university lawyer.
Yeah.
Okay, we have to shift this debate also to part of the break. I would like to invite Raid Sharif to give his paper. It's something different. Raid works with Paul Jorleer on open access, and he will present a future, a current PhD research project on a comparative analysis of access to scientific information in Latin America and all that. Great.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, actually, my presentation is a little bit different from presentations during today and yesterday. I came to this conference. Yeah, thank you. I come to this conference with an idea which has been developed during the last 2 months to a proposal study and conceptual framework, and that's what I'm presenting today to you. So I'll introduce my colleague here, Paul Euler, who's the Director of Office of Technical, Scientific and Technical Information Programs at the National Academies, and myself are working in this study, which is, again, at the design phase. Yeah, this one. So this is my outline for today. I'll be talking about some background information, then I have some introduction, then I'll talk about the study motivation and study design and concerns and limitations. So, some general information. We see the study fits with the themes of this conference about the past, present, and future research in information society, and our study fits with the future research. I'm not reporting on any case study or project or success story, although I really wanted to. I'm very jealous of this. Probably after 3 years, I'll be reporting on a success story in Latin America, but now I'm talking about this in the future. And it fits perfectly too with the theme of this session specifically, is that what open access actually signifies, access to whom, access to what for whom. So we'll be trying to have some answers for this. It's a joint study between the Board on International Organizations at US National Academies and the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. It's a major study, 2-year study, and again, I want to emphasize that the study is still at the design phase, and we welcome and appreciate your comments and questions and suggestions. Please be tough with this, because I'll not take it personally this time. Later, I'll take it personally. So, the introduction, I have been reading lately, and most of you know when you are a PhD student, you read a lot about the open access issues, and I really don't like to call it debate about it. It's a discussion, but sometimes we have different arguments, so that's why it's a kind of debate. But again, it's not a good or bad either or debate, which is good about it. It's very formative and a constructive debate. It's all about, so open access to what, for whom, how, when, and the advantages and disadvantages. We have many questions now, and we have lots of debate in the West, in the North, and in the South about this issue and how beneficial this is for us. And I believe that we need scientific and empirical answers for these questions. We cannot just come and write something about it and say, we believe that this will happen, or we expect that this will happen. So I emphasize the point of scientific and empirical. Theoretically, there is a fair amount of literature that talks about these issues, and I've been reading about it, and I'll cite most of them now. However, little is empirically known, especially about developing countries, which is my area of interest, about the actual status of access to information in general and scientific and technical information in particular, and the relationship between the level of open access to scientific and technical information and scientific productivity, which is very important for me. And when I say that there is the actual status of access to information in general, there is a study recently has been done in Europe, in European Union. They were commissioned to conduct this study about, they want to see if these freedom of information laws in most of European countries have been actually implemented and the actual use of it. So we are jumping to developing countries, which usually takes from 5 to 10 years to start talking about this at this time, which is ironic for us. So we have 4 kinds of motivations for the study, and I'll go quickly for this because I want to go to the research design. The first one is the importance of science for sustainable development, the importance of open access to scientific information for science and sustainable development. We have lots of interest in national and international levels in this area. And finally, Latin America is a very rich and enabling environment for the study for the reasons that I'll be talking about later on. So I'll skip quickly through these things. I'm citing lots of articles, reports, and documents about this. And it all talks about the importance of science. And I'm sure most of you and probably all of you are familiar of these things. I'm citing the Third World Academy of Science Beijing Declaration, which emphasizes the role of science for productivity and prosperity and scientific discovery. And then I found a very interesting book I was reading lately, which with the title Scientific Communities in the Developing Countries, where we have empirical evidence that these science and technology in developing countries are still occupy a very important role, and it's very promising for the development of these countries. We go to the second motivation, which is the importance of open access to scientific information for science and sustainable development. And again, I'm citing many documents here, and I refer to UNESCO, OECD, and different scholarly articles by Paul Euler and others, which talks mainly about the need for having open access, free access. They call for no restrictions of any kind of use on these things for sustainable development and science. And in their unpublished paper, I talked to them and they allowed me to cite it. It's still in press paper. They list many areas where open access to science can help us enhance our research and development and give us more opportunities. And I'll make my presentation available in case anyone wants to refer to these resources. And finally, with the importance of open access to scientific information, it's very fascinating that when we talk about this, we see that the governments, they are not making a favor for citizens or for scientists for making these publicly funded information available. We have different justifications. The first one is it's for legal consideration. It's considered as public good, publicly funded information. And for ethical consideration, we pay for this in advance. We pay for this, integrate these things and make it available for us. So they are not doing any favor. And for good governance consideration, this will enhance democracy and transparency. And finally, for socio-economic consideration, this will maximize the value and return on public investment. So we have different reasons why governments must go with this approach. And I don't know what they are hesitant. Probably my research will talk about these things. The third motivation is the international, at national, and the interest at national and international levels. And here I list some of the organizations that talk about this. We have ICSO, Data, UNESCO, OECD, XT, TWAS, national governments, national academies of sciences in different countries, universities, and individual academicians and professionals. So we have this kind of interest. And finally, why Latin America? Why did we choose to go to this place of the world? We had different motivations for this, and we were inspired by mainly two sources of information. I liked very much this study, which is empirical study again, which was conducted in 2002 and was published in 2003. And I refer to the workshop that was organized in 1999, where different Latin American experts came to Buenos Aires in Argentina, and they presented the actual status of open access to information. So the findings, the main two findings of the access to information in Latin America in 2003 is that it's promising. There is a growing number of these countries who is considering going into this area of having open access. And despite the many problems that we have, they consider it as a positive thing. And second, which is very important for our study, why we are conducting this study, is that we still don't have clear idea about what is going on. We have different kinds of problems. From government bureaucracy, they're hesitant to pursue this kind of information accessibility and other regulation related problems. What is important from this study and will help us to go ahead with our study is that it provided a very nice categorization of Latin American countries in terms of their status with open access to information. So it ranges from very long tradition of freedom to information to almost nothing about it in Cuba and Haiti. There is nothing in terms of practices, in terms of rules and regulations, even in terms of having any kind of call for these things. And we concluded that the freedom of information issues are at the forefront of national debate and policy making in Latin America's countries. So this gave us the motive to go to this place and to study it. And we still believe, and again, is it a very rich environment that we can find lots of resources of this. So let's go to the main point of my presentation today, the study design. I'll talk about the study questions, conceptual framework, study approach and methodology, and concerns and limitations. And I have 10 minutes for this. Great. So the study questions, we have two main questions. The first one is, what is the current status of open access to publicly funded scientific information in Latin American countries? The second one, which is the main goal of my study, the first one is descriptive. Anyone can go and do this. Probably it will not be as important as the second one. Is there a relationship between the level of open access to publicly funded scientific information and the actual scientific productivity? We want to come with empirical answers to the questions about, is open science beneficial and for whom? Then we move, welcome to the excitement. This is my conceptual framework, and this is the first time it sees the light. This is the first time I present this conceptual framework. So I received many comments about why do I have this comprehensive conceptual framework, why I don't start from different level here. Again, this is a comprehensive study for 2 years, and we have two institutions are working on this, and we will have different teams. So that's why we want to start from the very beginning and to track all the way these issues. So I start with the public content holders, the ones who control this data that was generated either by the government or the funds of the government. I want to see their attitude about it. What did they or do they think about having access to public information? This is very important for us. And if there is any current actions or potential future actions, then we will move to the policies and regulations and legislations in this area. We will look at each country and we will document all of these things. Then we will move to the important part of it, which is the model that they use for availability, if they use. And they will talk about different areas like availability, accessibility, accuracy, timeliness, and preservation. We then will talk about trust relationship between scientific communities and this model. And we are inspired with, and we would want to look to the scientific community's awareness to this availability, which is very important. Yesterday, this issue was brought up. So even if you have the information public and can be accessed, sometimes we don't know about it, or scientific communities in developing countries, they don't know about it. And we believe that this is a very important factor. And then we will look at the consumption and usability, and then the impact of this consumption and usability on the scientific productivity. And we have different areas that we will look at: the publications, projects, innovations, and international scientific cooperation. So I'll talk quickly about these things. This is what my professors like to see in my study, the variability. So this is the independent variable, and we have mediated variable, the trust relationship and their awareness, the scientific community's awareness, and this would lead us to the dependent variable that I'm trying to find out about. So again, the study approach and methodology is two parts. The first part is descriptive. We are not trying to do anything with it. We will document what we will have. We will use both quantitative and qualitative approach to collect and analyze data. In addition to the US team, I mean by US team, Syracuse University and national academies, we will have local teams from different Latin American countries. And here is very interesting. I was attending AMSIS, which is the American Conference Information Science conference in the US in last August. And I had a roundtable discussion with Latin American experts, and they showed interest in this kind of study. So we generated this interest, and we have contacts there. And finally, we will have one planning workshop at the beginning of the study to plan for this and to have some concerns and suggestions. And after we conduct the study, we will have 3 workshops at 3 countries to discuss and disseminate our data. So the first part about the attitude, which is very tricky here. We still think about how we can operationalize this variable. But basically, we will be conducting interviews and questionnaire. We will use document analysis. The sample will be purposive sampling because we want to have specific answers, and we want to talk to people who have these answers. And the target will be public content holders, mainly government agencies, universities, and non-profit research centers. And the questions that we will be asking, is there any explicit strategy or policy that you believe in, or you are calling for, or you are thinking of conducting, either now or in the future? And we will be having this for a course of 3 months. I didn't include the timeline, but I can talk about it. Then we will move to the scientific information public content holders, the policies and legislations on open access. And we want to see the current policies and legislations, and if there is any proposed ones. And again, I have the way we will collect data. We will use interviews and document analysis, and we will have purpose sampling, and we will have some questions about freedom of information legislations, intellectual property rights status, and national security restrictions, and other information policies. This is the first stage. After the first stage, we will have the findings. We will have very descriptive document about what is going on in Latin America. And based on this description, we will be able to say we can categorize these countries into 3 levels. The first level is low access, and then medium access, and high access. And why we want to categorize them? Because we need to see the relationship between the level of accessibility and scientific community, scientific productivity. So we might be able to come and say, it didn't matter a lot if they have high access to scientific information in terms of their productivity. So we will have some kind of comparison. We will move to the analytical part, where we'll be studying these areas. So we will see if the data or information is available. If it is available, is it accessible? If it is accessible, is it accurate? And is there any quality assurance mechanism that is used there? The timeliness, I'm not sure about this one. I used to use the word up-to-dateness, and then I was told it's not English word, so I changed this. And then the preservation of this. So this is the model that we are looking at. And again, we will use different techniques to collect data and analyze data. In our data collection, we will take into consideration different areas like technological issues, institutional and managerial issues, financial, legal and policy issues, and cultural and behavioral. And in our attributes, we will be talking about different kinds of things, from openness, transparency, and other issues. And finally, we will be talking about the independent variable, which is scientific productivity. I need to mention here that the trust relationship is very important. We need to see if there is trust between the scientific community and the scientific data that is published there. Because we believe that this is very important. If you don't believe that the data is accurate, or it doesn't have any bias, you can use it. If you don't believe in this, this might affect your actual demand on it. And we need to see how much this scientific community or these scientific communities are aware of the existence of these information. And then this will lead us to the consumption and usability, and then for scientific productivity. Quickly, we have other interesting relationships that we want to see. We want to see if the awareness and positive attitude can lead to policies and regulations or not. And we will want to see if this goes only one way or both ways. So if we have the policies, can this generate a nice scientific model, or it's vice versa? If we have a scientific model that we have open access, can this lead to generating policies and regulations? And finally, we want to see here if having the model itself will lead to consumption and usability, or the demand from scientific communities backward would create this kind of model. So these are other relationships that we are interested in. So the findings, discussion and dissemination, we will have a report out of this, because this is the norm in national academies. After we conduct a study, we have a report that is disseminated, and it's published online, as Michael was presenting yesterday. Hopefully I'll get my PhD thesis out of this, and other students from another university. And we will have 3 workshops in the 3 different countries that we used and we studied. Experts from all Latin American countries will be invited to these workshops. And finally, the concerns and limitations. This is the thing that I'll be probably working on the coming 2 years in my life about it. We believe that this is a very complex and sensitive area of study, so we have to take care of many things, and we are aware to the sensitivity and complexity of this. The operationalization of some concepts here is still vague for us. We need to read about it, and we need to find different kind of things. We are not sure about the responsiveness from both the government and scientific communities to our research. We need to conduct a pilot study or different pilot studies first. And discussion and dissemination of the findings and the future. The discussion and dissemination of the findings, we have different ideas about it, but mainly we will have workshops and we will use Latin American countries. We need to have the buy-in from them so they can go and disseminate this. And then we will be talking about future steps. We have no idea about what is going to be after we conduct our study, so this is very important to us too. And finally, any comments, questions, or suggestions, if possible, for this study? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Very commendable, the excellent study that you're setting up, but very many questions you raised. One of them, it seems to move between freedom of information to open access. To me, they are very, very different animals. Are you suggesting that you're going to look at freedom of information as a means to gain open access to the scientific information? Or are you saying that one of them will inform the other?
I think freedom to information both in these countries is a positive sign that we might have something about open access. So it's a one step towards having open access. So this is what is happening now in Europe. They have this kind of Freedom to Information Act, and the legislators, they use this act as justification to have open access to publicly funded information. So I see it as a positive thing more than any other thing. But I don't confuse them together.
Yeah, because I was cautioning you that because we're working with colleagues, for example, in China, on open access to scientific literature. And if we were to confuse that with Freedom to Information Act, the government would quickly move in and say, you know, forget about the other issue. So I think you need to be politically very sensitive about it.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question. So yes, Diane.
Very interesting and ambitious study. I was wondering, there's been some recent research that talks about how the characteristics of different scientific disciplines influences their approach to open access to scientific information and scientific data. Will you be taking that into account in your study?
Well, usually as a student, I don't need to have as much variables as possible, but I can take this into consideration. If you can point out some literature about it, I'll be definitely interested. Again, this is at the design stage, so we are not done with yet. We still receive lots of comments, and I thank Paul for sending me some comments earlier on this. So we still receive some comments. I have a meeting with my committee next week after I go back to the US, so I'll be happy to receive any comments and suggestions for this.
Okay, thanks a lot. So this is an invitation for interactive science. Help shape this project. Okay, we'll go to the last paper, which will be given by me and Katie Van. Katie is with the Virtual Knowledge Studio, specialist in political philosophy and web analysis, and science and technology studies. And what we're trying to do, if I can find the presentation, is to basically ask a question. So what we're trying to do is ask a question, come up with an argument on the basis of 3 empirical research projects. One is a project we did with Paul Julier, Peter Asberg and Jeffrey Bowker on data sharing. A second is work that has been done by our colleague Matt Retto on open source. And the third is a project that Katie is the principal investigator of, together with Anne Beaulieu, on web, the role of the web in governance. But the main question is, as the title of the paper indicates, it's a page down thing, yes, okay, what do we actually mean with open access? It's clear from this conference that it's a rallying cry in many ways for quite different actors. Who, of course, can form a coalition, and they quite smartly do so very strongly. At the same time, this has an intellectual disadvantage that the very different definitions of open access, the differences tend to become a bit blurred. it comes across, and this was also very clear yesterday in a couple of sessions, as an uncontroversial value, clearly a good thing to try to reach. But the point, of course, is that it doesn't mean a lot if you're not trying to be more specific. So our question is, okay, what do we actually mean? To what, for whom, and what do we mean by open? So, for example, the publishing company Wolters Kluwer doesn't have any problem with the open access movement because for them it's quite okay if everybody pays per page instead of per book. Whereas Steve Harnett, who is a bit of a champion of the open access movement, actually means to drive the publishers out of scientific publishing. So this is quite contradictory. Moreover, the notion of open access is also an intellectual product of very specific disciplines. And usually we tend to forget that a bit. Library and information science people, economists like the open commons type of economy, innovation economy, they are developing conceptual frameworks to frame open access, and in doing this they are using very specific assumptions about what science and technology is about. And it's quite important, we think, to try to be very aware of those assumptions and also of the implications this has for technological, political and intellectual strategies to engage with open access. Now the point is that this seems a bit contradictory, because if you want to strive for something, you try to overcome resistance you meet. And if you're, so it seems counterintuitive to try to see open access both as a goal and as an object to deconstruct, to try to open up and see what it might mean and where all the dilemmas and problems lie. Nevertheless, we think that it may be very worthwhile to include the intellectual interrogation of the notion of open access in the same open access movement and not leave it only to the opponents of open access. So this is a plea for a kind of reflexive analysis. I don't mean to say that everybody should do this. It's quite okay that we have champions of open access who simply refuse to be very sensitive to all the dilemmas, but as a whole it might be worthwhile to have a dialogue ongoing. Okay, this is one of the examples. The Netherlands, as you know, is a country which is relatively rich. It has a very well-developed computer network. It has an advanced scientific community in many disciplines. So basically, you would say the Netherlands is a country where open access is not a problem. Nevertheless, researchers in humanities and social sciences actually don't have a lot of access to advanced ICT instruments, and moreover they often don't want it. So seemingly there shouldn't be a problem, but there is clearly a problem in the sense that the use of ICT infrastructure and the funding that goes with it is very unevenly distributed across different scientific communities, even in an advanced and developed country like the Netherlands. So this is why the Academy started a new research program, the Virtual Knowledge Studio, which is this is a conceptual framework of this studio that we are now starting up this January. It will be active for the next 5 years. And the main thing that relates to open access is this bottom thing, the construction platform, which is a playful space where scholars in the humanities and social sciences are invited to create new scholarly practices using grid, the internet, ICTs, and old technologies like pencil and paper, so to try to come up with new ways of thinking about their research. So basically, we also see the Virtual Knowledge Studio as a kind of open access instrument, but in a very different way, in a very different type of thinking than open access as usually defined in this conference. And this is basically the central idea of it, which shows that it's not enough to have a big a big computer and strong computer network in the country. You really need to engage with the practices of people. And one example project is this. These are economists who are worrying, who are asking the question, why are some countries poor and others are rich? And they try to set up a collaboratory, but they don't have experience how to do this, because historians are not used in working in kind of collaboratory environment. So that's one of the things we are setting up. Okay, we think that in opening up this notion of open access, three intellectual key strategies may be relevant for us. One is to take resistance to open access seriously and not simply see it as a stumbling block or as conservatism or as something that must be overcome. So really go into where does this resistance come from. The second is to investigate the implicit assumptions about science and technology. And the third is to investigate real-world impact of open access platforms. So that's basically a plea for empirical research. Okay, I will very quickly pass through some slides about data sharing. It's clear that data have become crucial for the further development of scientific research. And the main point is that it also creates lots of questions and lots of new problems. So the basic question that we think is interesting is, suppose data sharing on a large scale becomes the dominant paradigm. How will research look like? How will quality control of research results and research projects have to be redefined? What is the ethics of doing research? What type of dilemmas or limitations do we need to impose? For example, in human subjects research, or in the combination of social science with medical data, that type of data, so integration of data. And we think that it is interesting to think more about the different configurations in which data sharing will be performed. And we think there are basically three that you can distinguish that have very different ways of acting out open access and data sharing, and that also actually point to different definitions of the core concept. Okay, we've done a couple of surveys on data sharing. I'm not going to mention those, I'm just showing them. The fact that there are so many different motivations points to the fact that there are basically two phases of data sharing. One is the policy perspective, and the other is the fact that it's a lot of work for researchers. Now this has to be accommodated. We can't simply ignore the second phase. And also, it would also be problematic to completely give in and say, okay, don't do it because it's such an amount of work. And it's not only extra work in terms of more labor, but it also redefines the divisions of tasks in research teams, the role of information experts with respect to scientific research, the role of institutions like archives and libraries, web archivist organizations. And so we think that it is still, there is still a lot of work that can be done on exploring more the dilemmas and limitations of data sharing in these different configurations. Okay, the open source movement is more has been studied a bit more extensively. We think there are very interesting results from this, and they also point to the fact that it's not just a matter of opening up your resources for sharing. It's really a matter of tuning in a very fine-grained way to the practices that you want to engage with, and to also open up technologies for spaces for discussion and deliberation. It's not only a matter of making information available, it's also a matter of how do you engage people to use new ways of communication to really also fight with each other about the meaning of the different concepts and the meaning of the different political goals. So the open source movement is a rich base of empirical findings pointing to the need for situated understanding, also of so-called universal standards. So this translation between universality and situatedness. Okay, and this brings me to I've been going very quickly through the data sharing, and I hope I'm not making you feel a bit... I think that there is an important lesson already from the empirical study so far. One is that open access is of course politically a good rallying cry as such, but if you think about how to realize it, it's always the product of access regimes, of configurations in which many different actors play their role. And the main criteria for success, you could say, often is the practice to which it relates and the meaning it has for the actors in that practice. So it's a combination of cultural meaning and economic and political configurations. Now, this points to an interesting dilemma, theoretically, and I'm not sure whether philosophers have already developed this, but it's striking in the debates at this conference that this dilemma is a bit under the table. One is that if you want to create knowledge, you're always making two operations. One is to create boundaries, because you have to make clear about which particular part of reality your knowledge is relevant. And the second is, it's always stratification. You're always stratifying. Some things are more important than other things. Without some kind of hierarchy, it's not possible to have knowledge. Well, this goes counter to the metaphors and the ways of thinking about open access. Open access is all about universality, standards, open to everybody, at all times, in all places, and then preferably all knowledge. That was, for example, a main motive yesterday in a very interesting presentation from the Library of Alexandria. And it is a driving motivation. It also, I mean, it's clearly fires up people. But there is an interesting tension with the very act of creating knowledge. I think that this contradiction translates in two different ways. One is that there are different communities active in this open access thing. One is the people who are creating infrastructure, and the other are the people who are supposed to develop practices in those infrastructures. And these communities, it's difficult for the communities to talk to each other. So part of this tension has been solved by a division of tasks and by non-communication between these communities, or parts of communication. The interesting thing of this conference, of course, is that these communities are, in the same space. And the other contradiction is this universal versus the local. The need to think about how we can translate between those. And on that point, I would like to give Katie Van the floor.
Can you turn these things off, please?
Sure.
I want to just connect with you for a minute, just to let you know I'm not strictly speaking going to talk about access. I will stay on the theme of opening up, this one too, please. That's not, I don't want it on. To sort of open up a prevailing notion that is that political activities, better political activities should be oriented to the fostering of local autonomy and creative expression for local people. I'll be problematizing this notion. Now, it's very late. If you would like to hear what I have to say, please stay, but it's fine with me if you'd like to leave. It's just cooling down as I am. One of the projects that we're doing at the studio is we came up with a pithy title for it. It's called In the Web and On the Ground. And it's about a transnational participatory water management paradigm that originates in the global north, I guess that's what you call it, primarily Northern Europe and some parts of the United States. And the effort is to transform the way that water resources are managed on a global scale. And what's sort of the object of my research about this event is the attempt to diffuse particular forms of management action. So I'm not strictly interested in particular water management conflicts per se, but the idea that you could globalize or instantiate on a transnational scale a particular form of management activity. So the project is really focused on discourse. We're looking at how the management model is circulated through the World Wide Web, and also how that discourse is drawn on by local actors to instantiate their own actions as versions or instances of that model. Now, just one quick note about this. I just want to emphasize that this is a very different approach to the study of global-local relations than one typically finds. Is there any water that I could? Would you mind if I? No? Thank you. I asked for water from the Secretary of Defense. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. The sort of what I find is becoming the knee-jerk reaction in globalization studies is to say, well, yeah, there's this. Come on in if you like. There's this global event that's being circulated, and in many cases it either refers to local activities or local identities, or it's supposed to impinge on them in some way. And then the task of research becomes one of, well, what's really happening? Are they really doing it that way, or how are they transforming the way McDonald's or what have you happens there? And the approach to this study is very different in that it's not a question of what's the discrepancy between local activities and globally circulated representations of those activities, but rather, insofar as local practices are supposed to be instances of that, how is that instantiation achieved as such? Now, one thing I want to bring to the discussion today is a little puzzle that I've been working with in this study that has bearing on methodologies in the social studies of science. And in order to try to grasp this with you, I'm going to read a little excerpt that is from the literature in STS that has itself been widely circulated. It's a literature that is found in social anthropology by now, in social studies of science, in neo-institutional theory, in organizational studies of various stripes. And it says, boundary objects are both plastic enough to adapt to local needs and the constraints of several parties employing them, yet robust enough to maintain a common identity across sites. I don't know if you all are familiar with this literature, but it goes on. But the basic idea there is that you have these sort of, these objects that somehow provide a kind of a glue or sort of a common, we might say in the words of Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Leclau, kind of articulation device across a variety of particular practices. Now, this literature has been, it's largely deployed as a way of describing and explaining the dynamics of social relationships and organizational processes, and describing them in ways that presumably prior sociological theory of organization failed to grasp. So it's an enlightening kind of discourse about how we should understand social relationships. And an important point is that even when you have the most sort of attempts to overly rigidify or overly predict or overly prescribe or constrain the activities that are covered under the rubric of a boundary object, the sort of necessity theoretically achieved is that they will always be transformed in their local instantiation. So again, it's a descriptive sociological discourse about how things occur. Now, the water management paradigm that I'm studying, the acronym, Christine and I have been noticing a lot of acronyms this week. It always happens, I suppose, but it's called Integrated Water Resource Management. Many of you may know about it. But I just want to read one bit from some of the technical materials that are used by water managers to try to help people along, capacity development literature, to help people along in trying to make this happen in different places. And it says, there's no universal blueprint as to how this paradigm should be created, whereas certain basic principles underlying IWRM may be commonly applicable. Independent of context and state of economic development, there is no universal blueprint as to how such principles can be put into practice. The nature, character, and intensity of problems, on and on and on. Practical implementation of approaches derived from common principles must reflect such variations in local conditions, and thus will necessarily take a variety of forms. Now, what's intriguing to me is that, sort of, when I first see this material, I think, thank God they finally got it. They've been studying their STS really well. They could have been students of Lee Stars, and they're out there trying to change the world. This is great. But then on the other hand, I'm just thinking, well, what does it mean to think of these as very well-informed realists who are attempting to transform the practices of other people? And furthermore, it begs the question of what is at stake in having a homogeneous prescriptive discourse whose own content is that it cannot be overdetermined. That is, its own positive content is its own flexibility and its own diversity. Well, it begs the question of what's going on when it becomes imperative that local populations need to use that very discourse to enunciate their own activities as being of a specific class. And so while I was raised with mom and apple pie, like everyone else from the States, and democracy is a very powerful thing with which we're raised, and the idea that we should have autonomy and that we should be part of a collective that transcends our own idiosyncrasies, that we should maybe keep to ourselves after all. While that's a very important aspect of democratic reasoning, it's precisely the way in which globalizing hegemonic formations have internalized this what would appear to be the avenue out of hegemonic relations as their own positive content that I'm concerned about. And so it's a question of how do you think through the power relations involved in requiring that democracy be the language that people speak when they describe their own activities to other people.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we are approaching the time that the next session has to prepare, so I propose that we have space for some questions, if they are there, and maybe some concluding questions about all the papers. In the meantime, please feel free to connect your laptop for the next session. Any questions? Everybody wants coffee? Okay. Thanks. All the other speakers are in line.